Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video, I'm going to be ranking the studio albums of Jimi Hendrix, but this video is going to be a lot more than just that, because this has been a very troublesome and difficult ranking to do. And that is because Hendrix recorded for 4 years. In that period of time, he created so many recordings, and those recordings initially came out on 3 absolutely classic albums: Axis Boulder's Love, Are You Experienced, and Electric Ladyland. And on those 3 albums, he is making not only his statement about the sound and his playing and his singing and his songwriting, but he's also making a statement about the production and the running order and the mix and all that sort of stuff. Hendrix was completely in control of all that. So, but he carried on recording after that, and he recorded a vast amount of stuff. And this stuff has been repackaged since he died in 1970, almost infinitely. So there are so many different albums out there. The albums that I grew up listening to were compilation albums, in effect, that came out in the early 80s, and those were the albums that I knew. I didn't so much know his actual studio albums. I was buying all these other mid-priced compilation albums that didn't say the best of Jimi Hendrix. They would be called something like Voodoo Child, or they might be called Stone Free, and because I like those tracks, I bought those albums. They were the albums for me. I'm not going to count those albums on here, because if I start to do that, it is literally hundreds and hundreds of albums. So what I'm going to try and do on this video is I'm going to firstly rank the albums. I'm not going to mess you lot around this today. I am actually going to rank the albums, because I know there's just some people want me to go through those albums. And you might be thinking, well, what about this album? Why is it that on there? And why is this one on there? Well, I'm going to do a very deep dive after my ranking to try and give you an idea of what the studio albums actually are, how they relate to the recordings, and just go through the whole history surrounding his discography. Now, this is made even more complex because I cannot think of another musician that whose live recordings are so important, which are not being included here. His performance at Monterey Pop Festival is legendary, and of course that has been released as an album over and over again. His performance at Woodstock is legendary, where he did the Star Spangled Banner. Again, that is a legendary album. And then there's other albums that have become really important. I'm not going to be talking about those albums. We'll leave that to another day. But I'm going to include one live album, which is the Band of Gypsies, because it's all new material, and it almost acts as a 4th album that was released within Jimi's lifetime, or at least enough of his lifetime for him to have some artistic control over it. So let's start with the rankings to start off with, and then I will get into my deep dive. So at number 9, I have an album called 9 to the Universe. It was really, produced by Alan Douglas. Alan Douglas was a guy that recorded Hendrix a lot in the latter stages. And after Hendrix died, he did all sorts of things with the recordings. After repackaging a lot of the studio recordings that hadn't been released, he then took a deep dive into some of the improvisations. Now, whether Jimi would have wanted this to be released, I don't know. Which is why it's right on the bottom of the list, but it is unique studio material. And on here we have a jam between Jimi Hendrix, Buddy Miles, and Larry Young from Tony Williams' lifetime, and David Holland, the bass player with Miles Davis. And that jam, if you listen to it, I assume recorded before Jack Johnson, is as important as Jack Johnson by Miles Davis in terms of showing the way rock and jazz musicians were working together to negotiate something that we now call jazz rock or jazz rock fusion. It's a fascinating recording. Some of the other ones are pretty low quality, but for that reason, I think I need to class it. There are other improvisation and jams that have come out, and I'm not going to be classing those. But 9 to the Universe came out like a proper album. And the fact that Larry Young is on it is always it's been mentioned a number of times in jazz biographies and encyclopedias. So you will come across that. So that's what I've got at number 9. At number 8 and number 7, I'm going to do these together. I have the Alan Douglas produced albums Midnight Lighting and Crash Landing. These are the albums that came out in the mid-70s, where Alan Douglas decided to take tracks that Hendrix had recorded, supposedly unfinished tracks, and then get contemporary musicians at the time to overdub over the top. Right, he's been criticised for this, but it does contain some incredible material. The other contentious thing about these albums is he, in erasing the drums and the bass parts, got composer credits on these albums. And it makes you wonder whether the actual original drums and bass are sort of okay, but you could see a way in. It's done actually very well. And certain tracks on those albums, I love them. Absolutely love them. So I put those both together. If I was going to split one between the other, I'd probably go to Crash Landing at number 7 and Midnight Lightning at number 8, because Crash Landing came first, and I think Alan Douglas cherry picked a lot of the stuff there. At number 6, I have another Alan Douglas album called Loose Ends. Now, Hendrix recorded a ton of stuff for a double album in 1970, and that provides the vast amount of recordings for all these posthumous releases. Once they'd scraped the barrel of that, there was the few literally loose ends. It's still got some incredible stuff. Going through Jimmy's catalogue, it is just, this guy was a genius. I'm going to talk about this later, for how important this guy is in terms of rock and roll, pop, rock and roll, whatever you want to call it. And I can't think of any other musician that just hit 5 stars every time they went into the studio. And these scrapings are testament to that. The only thing that's lacking from them is Jimmy's genius vision, because he has not inflicted his vision onto these recordings. And also, Jimmy actually had a very high quality standard when he went into the studio. And Eric Kramer, reports having to record tracks, maybe 15, 16 times till he got a take he was happy with. Now, if he was doing that, is it morally right for this to be going on here, where Alan Douglas has gone, well, I found this recording, I don't know what it is, but let's release it because we can make some cash out of Jimmy's name. And so that's what I got at number 6, is Loose Ends. At number 5, I have First Rays of the New Rising Sun, which is an album that came up relatively recently, a few years back, and it was an attempt by Mitch Mitchell and Eddie Kramer to create the double album that Jimmy intended releasing in 1970. So it pulls together all those 1970s recordings. It is absolutely brilliant. Those tracks are brilliant. The fact that we've got it at number 5 on this list is no criticism. This is some of the classic stuff of Hendrix, and in a way the most developed. This sound that he developed, which was somewhere between heavy rock, jazz and funk and soul. At this point he'd got a sound which is what we associate with Hendrix, and this sound is just completely consolidated. Tracks like Easy Rider, Isabella, these are just classic Hendrix tracks, and so it's an essential purchase. In the 70s, these albums were put out as 3 separate albums. The first being Rainbow Bridge. The first being Cry of Love, that was released I can't say that, can I, today? Posthumously. So Cry of Love came out in 1971, just after Jimmy had died. For many people, it's seen as his sort of 4th studio album, and I think it's not far off, but it wasn't Jimmy's vision. So we've got Cry of Love in 1971. Then we've got Rainbow Bridge, which is supposedly the soundtrack to a film. I will talk about the film later. It's one of the most bizarre stories, and I cannot believe that this story does not get told when we come to, talking about Jimi Hendrix. There is so much when you start to dive into this, but despite all the biographies, all the books, you still unearth new facts about Jimmy. This guy burnt bright. There's just no denying it. The amount he packed into those 3 or 4 years, there is nothing in music history that's equivalent to that. Maybe some of the Charlie Parker recordings, the bebop recordings in the 40s. It's just bonkers. And maybe the Hot Fives as well. Hot Fives and Hot Sevens by Louis Armstrong. And that's to look at those three periods, to look at Louis, look at Charlie Parker, and look at Jimi Hendrix. They both own their respective part of popular music. It's incredible. They own it. They are the sound innovators of those periods of music. But I want to get into a deeper discussion about this later. Let's just not annoy the fair weather viewers who just want me to get through the review as quick as possible so they can bugger off. So, yeah. So Rainbow Bridge comes out in, I think, 1971 as well. And then we get War Heroes, which is the patchiest of the three, I would say. It's still really good, which came out in 1972. We are now on to the albums that were released in his lifetime. At number 4, I've put Axis Boulder's Love, which is his second album, which is like his Sgt. Pepper. It's one of the greatest albums ever made, right? The fact that I've got it at number 4 is no criticism of it. It's just the other ones are so much better, and we're talking about some of the greatest albums ever made, period, now. At number 3, I've put Band of Gypsies. Band of Gypsies for jazz musicians, jazz rock musicians, for guitarists. That is the album. This is where he broke up the Experience and put together this band of Gypsies, which contained Buddy Miles and Billy Cox, who were much funkier, both black musicians, much blacker sound. And my personal favourite Hendrix album is Band of Gypsies. You hear them just playing, right? So at a number 2, I got Electric Ladyland. I had it at number 1. I got Electric Ladyland, which is just an absolute masterpiece. A double album where Hendrix just creates one of the first progressive rock albums, which each side is like a suite of music, and it just explores psychedelia, funk, rock, soul, the blues. It goes back to the beginnings of music. It goes forward to the future of music, and really is one of the greatest albums that ever made. But at number 1, obviously, I have Are You Experienced, his first album. I will talk about this later when I start to go through these albums in order and try to piece together the story behind how they were made. But suffice to say, going through them chronologically and going alongside my recent ranking of the Beatles, where I've gone through every single Beatles album, and you see the incredible genius of the Beatles as they are pushing rock music forward. And then 66, 67, you no longer feel that the Beatles are quite in the right place. And there's dissent. They're not getting on with each other anymore. They want to go off and do their own things. This coincides with Jimi Hendrix emerging. And if you listen to what the Beatles are doing in 1966, which remember is way beyond what anyone else is doing on the planet, and then you suddenly hear Hendrix. Hendrix went to the studio in autumn 1966 and he recorded Hey Joe. And he also then needed a B-side and he recorded Stone Free. And for me, Stone Free is light years ahead of anything the Beatles had ever done. This came over and usurps the Beatles. Hendrix often called the Black Elvis. I think he was the one-man Beatles. I think that's what he was. And he just takes over and goes, now, I've got the ball now. I'm running with it. Are You Experienced, with tracks like Purple Haze and Foxy Lady, and the track Are You Experienced is just unbelievable. And I think it's not necessarily Jimmy's greatest album, but if you want to understand Jimi Hendrix and you were only going to buy one album, it would be Are You Experienced? So that's my ranking of the videos. I've gone through that as quick as I possibly can. The next thing I'm going to do is a little bit of biography on Jimi Hendrix. And then I will try and give you a shape of the albums so you understand where they fit and how they were recorded and go through that. And then I'm going to go through each album and discuss them. That is the nature of this video. It's going to be a long one. It's a deep dive. Right, so part 2, biography of Jimi Hendrix. Jimi was born in 1942. He did not come from a well-off family, so he wasn't handed an electric guitar at the right age, but I think his dad gave him an acoustic guitar at some point. He was enthralled by rhythm and blues and rock and roll and all that type of stuff, and he took that up. He then joined the army. He was invalided out of the army. I think it was a parachute corps when he injured himself, and he met a number of musicians in the army. From there, he comes out the army and he goes onto the Chitlin circuit into America, playing with people like Little Richard and Sam and Dave. Now, the Chitlin circuit is that place where black musicians have to go out and earn their crust. And in doing so, they have to be able to perform. Little Richard, Sam and Dave, these were electrifying performers. So Jimi Hendrix coming out of the blues, goes onto this circuit, and he learns from guitarists like T-Bone Walker, from Chuck Berry, to do the tricks. He does it a little bit too successfully. He actually starts to overshadow the people he's playing for. But this is a training ground for Jimi. Jimi knows how to go in front of an audience and blow them away. In 1966, he arrives in London. He sort of goes out and starts playing around in London, and he's spotted straight away. Chas Chandler, who was the bass player of the Animals, takes him on in the management role and gets him a record deal. And before he knows it, he's in the studio. Right, everyone in London's chatting about this guy. He's turned up at Cream gigs. Now, Cream have come out in 1966, and they have this power trio sound. They have put together American electric blues coming from Muddy Waters. But there's a jazz tradition in the UK that started out with traditional jazz, then ran into skiffle. There was also a modern jazz movement. My dad was a part of the modern jazz movement, listened to people like Dave Brubeck. And so what you had in London was jazz musicians like Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce coming together with blues musicians, in effect, like Eric Clapton. And this creates something that never really happened in American blues, which is this sort of long guitar solo based high power, because they have the Marshall amplifier, high power sound. Within that, there's a backdrop of this whole hippie things going, and people are trying to blow their mind. In 66, you've got Pink Floyd at UFO Club. And so everything moves in a certain way, and Cream are the pioneers for this. Now, I wonder how much Hendrix, arriving in London, saw what Cream was doing and went, oh, that's amazing, that's what I want to do. Or whether he arrived with that sound in his head, because we're talking about weeks here when Hendrix signs and he sees Cream. There's a very famous bit of footage of Hendrix when he's on the Lulu show, and he comes out and does one of his songs. And then, because Cream had just I think it's 68, because that's when Cream stopped. Cream had said they were going to break up, and he does an impromptu tribute to Cream on national television, which suggests to me that he held Cream in a very high esteem. That rhymed. That was cool. Anyway, so he goes to the studio with this sort of sound. He is picking up on certain folk songs like Hey Joe, which is had been popularised by Tim Rose, which brings in that sort of singer-songwriter sound that's coming from Bob Dylan. He was a huge Bob Dylan fan. And like I said, he also records Stone Free, which is a lot more soulful, a lot more riffy. It's got some incredible guitar playing on it. This first album comes out and basically is the game changer. Right, Purple Haze, one of the big singles off it, is a leap forward in what I would call heavy music. I see 20th century popular music as the evolution of heaviness in all its forms. I'm not just talking about heavy metal, but that is one form of it. I'm talking about heaviness in terms of the chords, the riffs. I'm talking about in terms of the vibe, the coolness. Ted Gioia was on Rick Beato, and I watched him last night, and he was talking about coolness. Coolness is a thing that emerges in the late 40s with Miles Davis, and it runs all the way through the period of rock and roll. Hendrix is the coolest. Hendrix is the coolest, right? And coolness and heaviness all comes together for me on Purple Haze. That's never been surpassed, you know. And so this first album is absolutely groundbreaking. Within a few months, Hendrix back in the studio and he brings out his second album, which is called Are You Experienced? No, it's not. It's called Axis Boulder's Love. Um, and on Axis Boulder's Love, he brings a lot more of a soulful sound. You got to remember that James Brown had recorded Cold Sweat in '67, and I think that has an influence. Hendrix would have known that stuff inside out. He would have already been there working on the Chitlin circuit, that stuff that was underground that then explodes into funk with James Brown and then Sly and the Family Stone. He's a part of that. And I've always seen Axis Boulder's Love as being the integration of this sort of funky, soulful sound. This was his first proper studio album I ever bought, and I just thought it was brilliant because suddenly you get the tale that Hendrix is telling from the sort of sound effects of, was it EXP at the beginning? You know, running right up to Axis Boulder's Love. Have you ever? You know, all that stuff is just incredible. This is an incredible album, a statement more than Are You Experienced, which was more like singles that have been put together. This album flows. He takes that idea and he starts recording in '67 to '68 what would become Electric Ladyland. These recordings are endless and chaotic, and Eddie Kramer and Chas Chandler, who was acting as producer on this album, are getting very frustrated because what Hendrix is doing is bringing loads of people down to the studio, packing it out, having a massive party and just recording. You get all sorts of people all over this album. But in doing my research, I found out he was also meticulous. Like Gypsy's Eyes, I think he recorded it 17 times to get the take he wants. And he has an idea of telling a story, and this story just opens up. Some of the tracks are like 15 minutes long. It's the beginning of progressive rock, but because it's so much more than progressive rock, it doesn't get classed as that. It's the beginning of jazz rock as well. Again, it doesn't get classed as that. It's the beginning of heavy metal with some of the riffing. Again, it doesn't get classed as that. Hendrix is so far out that he is almost forgotten in the equation, I think, of music history. So these are the 3 studio albums that were made in Jimmy's lifetime. I'll go through them again. Are You Experienced, Axis Boulder's Love, and Electric Ladyland. So let's put those 3 studio albums that were made in his lifetime. You have to see those. They're very important in understanding the sort of layout of Jimmy's work. He then, through 1969, seems to go out and play live. You know, he plays Woodstock in '69, and a lot of the footage, if you go out and see the actual live footage, not TV shows or anything like that, you will find that a lot of that footage is coming from that '69 period. He's not recording that much. In fact, the only real recording I can find in that period, I think, I'm probably wrong, but I think is Band of Gypsies. Now, Band of Gypsies was recorded on New Year's Eve 1969, so right at the tail end. It's a live album with this new band. Now, let's get into the Jimi Hendrix experience, because I haven't mentioned this. The band that was put together by Chas Chandler was made out of London musicians, Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums. Mitch Mitchell had come up through the blues boom. I think he'd played with Alexis Corner. I think so. I can't remember now. And Mitch Mitchell, like Ginger Baker and John Heisman, was coming out of a sort of rock approach, which you can probably, point at Ringo Starr, the backbeat approach. But they're playing that in an exploratory way, like a jazz player. Mitch Mitchell, you could tell, is very influenced by Tony Williams and Elvin Jones. What Hendrix does, and he takes this from Cream, is to lock down the sound with the bass. In fact, Jimi Hendrix's experience, I think, is more successful in Cream, in that Jack Bruce often would fly off with the rest of them, and it tends to get a little bit more anchored by the sort of standard blues pentatonic playing of Eric Clapton. With Hendrix, He has on bass Noel Redding. Now, Noel Redding's not a bass player, and he's come from a sort of folk background. He got the gig because he had the big hair. You know, Mitch, Jimmy, and Noel all had the big hair, so he got the gig. Noel is a fine bass player, great sense of feel, great sense of groove. He was in a band called Fat Mattress at the time, and from what I can tell, he's an okay bass player, but he wasn't there a lot of the time. When we get to the second album, An Electric Ladyland, I don't think he's actually on those albums that much. I think Jimmy's playing the bass. The reason for this was not because he wasn't good enough, but because Noel was a canny guy and he noticed he was getting ripped off by the people around him. He had an issue with Chas Chandler, and when Chas Chandler, didn't pay him the money he was owed, he walked. So suddenly the Jimi Hendrix experience is not going. I think those guys had burnt themselves out and not really got paid. So the experience in 1968 sort of dissolves, and so he then pulls in Buddy Miles. Now, he'd met Buddy Miles in New York at a jam session. All these jam sessions are going on, and this is where he meets John McLaughlin, and we have this sort of jam that has existed that when I was a kid was almost like legendary. I didn't even know it existed, and then the internet comes out and we suddenly find there's this recording of him with John McLaughlin, and at that point he meets Buddy Miles and he brings his mate Billy Cox in on bass, under the sort of direction now of Alan Douglas. On New Year's Eve they record this live album, Band of Gypsies. Now because it's a live album and it's pretty much what Jimmy played, I class this as being in the group of the albums that he made when he was alive. And so the way I have always seen it is we have these 3 studio albums, and then Band of Gypsies acts like a studio album because it's all new material with a new band, right? And the band has a different sound, okay? Now, after that album was recorded, through 1970, Jimmy is in the studio making his next epic, which I'm sure he wanted to outdo Electric Ladyland. So he's recording a lot of incredible stuff at this point. But in September, he dies. A lot of these tracks are finished. They've been recorded. You got Eddie Kramer in there, so they can be mixed and they exist. And Jimmy has created a lot of material. Anything else that is outside the albums I've just listed that you hear that's just studio recorded was recorded in that time period. It's quite astonishing, all right? When Jimmy died, it was pulled together and released as an album called Cry of Love. This album came out just a few weeks after Jimmy died, so many people see this as being the sort of 4th studio album. But actually, these were put together, not by Jimmy, by Eddie Kramer and Alan Douglas. So we have another 3 albums here. So in the early 70s, this material that was recorded in 1970 was released on 3 albums, which was Cry of Love, Rainbow Bridge, and War Heroes. So now we've got a nice little neat thing in our heads. We can see that in terms of chronological releases, we have these 3 albums recorded when he was alive, right? We then have Band of Gypsies, which is a live album. Then we have these 3 albums that were released after he died. These albums were big deals. People bought them. There was a massive interest in Hendrix. He was still a huge rock star. So for people coming up in the 1970s of a certain age, these were the next 3 Hendrix albums. And when you put them on, the material on there is absolutely brilliant. Some of Hendrix's best. Okay, now, after that, we get 3 more albums, which for me, we could call the Alan Douglas Scraping the Barrel albums. The first being Loose Ends. Now, we start to get, jams falling apart, Jimmy talking to the engineer on this album. It's still got some incredible stuff on there, but this is where he starts to get really ripped off. Now, I want to go through to an idea of how Jimmy was getting ripped off and how he got ripped off after he died. once Chas Chandler threw in the towel, he was managed by a guy called Michael Jeffrey. Michael Jeffrey was involved in some of the releases of these albums, and Michael Jeffrey had an idea to make a film. He'd had this idea when Jimmy was alive, so they booked a gig in Maui, which was this little island in the Pacific, and the band went down there and they set up in this, field, and they invited a bunch of hippies down and they filmed this. And after Jimmy died, Michael Jeffrey tried to make a film, like a fictional feature film about these hippies going down to this Maui, and in the background we've got this Jimi Hendrix film, and this film comes out. It's truly awful. It's just awful. Improvised dialogue. The camera work's a bit dodgy, but the actual footage was well filmed. The recording of Hendrix, there was this gale blowing through, so Jimmy was not recorded that well, especially with the drums. There's wind all over the drums, so Mitch Mitchell went in and re-recorded the drums. I think the bass may have been re-recorded as well, but the drums definitely were. Now this has now come out as this Live at Maui, and there's a documentary about this as well. And when I listened to it, although they say they've gone back to the original recordings, it sounds like the recorded drums. So this is an example of Hendrix having major things released under his name, films, albums, more films, documentaries, of which he has no artistic control of whatsoever. And Jimmy, at this point, was getting booked out by his management for around about $30,000 a gig. Right, his management were almost like blackmailing the venues by offering him, them selling tickets, and said, "Well, it's going to be 30,000," and the band weren't seeing any of this, And after Jimmy died, Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding saw none of this. This is a major thing you have to get your head round: is how much Jimmy was ripped off and how much worse it got after he died. So we have these three albums that sort of Alan Douglas put together. Mike Jeffries actually died in 1974. And so he's gone. Alan Douglas seems to then take over. Then he's got carte blanche to do whatever he wants. And he releases these albums. Loose Ends is, like, as we say, is a scrapings of the bottom of the barrel. And then Crash Landing and Midnight Lightning are the albums where he got musicians to overdub over the top. Now, it's including guitar. He's got Jeff Mironoff on guitar. Now, Jeff Mironoff is the guitarist that was used by Gil Evans on his tribute to Jimi Hendrix album. There was a plan when Hendrix was alive to work with Miles Davis and Gil Evans. It never happened, but some of the ideas Gil then pulled together, and he pulled Jeff Mironoff in to take the part of Jimi Hendrix. Now, he was obviously chosen by Gil because he sounds like Jimi Hendrix. The fact that he's on these albums starts to make you realise whether it is Jimmy playing that guitar solo or that rhythm guitar part, or whether it's somebody else. But within that, there's some incredible tracks. When I was a kid, in the early, about 83, 84 maybe, they brought out an album called Voodoo Child. And I bought that. I thought it was a studio album. It had a picture of Jimi Hendrix on it. It said Jimi Hendrix Voodoo Child. So I bought it. And on there was a couple of tracks. I think, was it Message to Love? Message to Love, which had come from these albums. So when I was listening to it, I did not know that these recordings were not the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Now, here's another interesting things about Jimi Hendrix that I've realised is that you've got the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which is Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding. Then you've got Band of Gypsies, which is Billy Cox, Buddy Miles. When he goes back in to record this vast amount of stuff in 1970s that lays the foundation for all this repackaged stuff, the band is basically Billy Cox and Mitch Mitchell. Now, I think that this is the best incarnation of the band. Buddy Miles is a fantastic drummer, but he was a much more of a straight-ahead, funky drummer, coming out sort of the black rhythm and blues that was around at the time. Mitch Mitchell is perhaps the greatest rock drummer of the 60s, greater than Bonham, greater than Ginger Baker. what he's doing on the drums is absolutely incredible. And then to have that virtuoso bass playing from Billy Cox, who has got the ability to hold it down like Noel Redding, but also played a lot more funkier and exploratory way. And this is why I think these 1970s recordings that weren't released properly are so brilliant. Hendrix had got the ideal power trio. Perhaps the greatest power trio of all time. Can you think of one greater than this? Jimi Hendrix, Billy Cox, and Mitch Mitchell, right? That was never released properly. This is this mess that we have when we look at Jimi Hendrix's catalogue, right? So these 70s recordings were repackaged by Alan Douglas later on for an album called Voodoo Soup, further confusing the issue. And then Eddie Kramer and Mitch Mitchell, trying to imagine what Jimmy wanted, released the album First Rays of the New Rising Sun. Now, I've got to be honest, I haven't actually sat down and listened to First Rays of the New Rising Sun all the way through. I have no idea whether this is what Hendrix intended or not what Hendrix intended. And this is the real problem in looking at this catalogue. But I want to now give you a shape, right? So, 3 studio albums when he was alive. I Experience, Axis Boulder Love, and Electric Ladyland. Band of Gypsies, which is a live album, but we've classed it in there, but we could take that away. Then we have the 3 albums that came out in the early 70s, which represent the 1970 recordings, which would be Cry of Love, Rainbow Bridge, and War Heroes, right? Then we have the stuff that Alan Douglas scrambled together, including 2 albums where there's musicians replacing the parts or playing the parts that didn't exist. And that would be Loose Ends, and then the 2 patched up albums, Crash Landing and Midnight Lightning. So we've got 3, 3, and 3, right? Now, if we think about it, those 3 albums that came out in the middle all came from 1970. That was the last stuff Hendrix recorded. That could well be the greatest stuff. But we can hear it. We can hear what Jimmy did. What we just don't have is Jimmy's genius. So there's been a biography of me going through the album. So we're now going to move on to part 3, where I want to talk about Jimi Hendrix's legacy, right? Which I feel I have a much greater understanding of now that I've done this research into trying to get the shape. I love Jimi Hendrix. I've loved Jimi Hendrix for over 40 years, about 45 years I've been a fan of Jimi Hendrix. Certain bands I've loved, I've not liked. Certain bands I've learned to like as I've got older. The one thing through rock music, pop music, soul, funk, whatever you want to call it, fusion, jazz, prog, whatever, the one guy that I've unremittingly felt was an absolute genius was Jimi Hendrix. I think that when there's a movement in music, a musician emerges whose personality is subsumed by that genre, or the genre subsumes them. By this, what I mean is that if we look at jazz, there's this thing called jazz that emerges in, on record in the 1910s, 1920s, and then Louis Armstrong comes out, and Louis Armstrong, in his personality, the way he plays, the way he sings, his ideas of arrangement and composition, that basically becomes the sound of that genre. And so Louis Armstrong influences everybody. The way he plays, the way he composes, it influences everybody. Drummers sound like Louis Armstrong. Singers sound like Louis Armstrong. Clarinetists sound like Louis Armstrong, right? And that sound carries on. It is built upon, and that sound is then broadened out into the big bands of Duke Ellington, of Count Basie, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw of the 1930s. And that's how jazz toddles along. A new generation then come in, and they want to move beyond what Louis Armstrong has done. And these are the beboppers. And another musician emerges, exactly the same thing. A sound innovator whose phrasing, note choice, personal charisma, their life, everything is now going to represent what jazz becomes. And that's the bebop era of jazz. And this is where this idea of virtuosity emerges within the popular music realm. And that carries on, and that carries on with the sorts of jazz that Louis Armstrong pioneered, doing a side shoot and moving out and eventually becoming rock and roll and rock. And moves out in a number of different strange ways. In America, the sort of jump up rhythm and blues bands like Louis Jordan, Chuck Berry then comes in, combines that with a bit of country music, and then we've got rock and roll. But here in the UK, we have the trad jazz boom emerge in the 1940s, right? Out of that comes people like Lonnie Donegan, and they're listening to Lead Belly, Dixieland Jazz, and that all gets constituted together. Plus, in America, that bebop sound has emerged into hard bop and cool jazz. And here in the UK, cool jazz is taken up by young people. And they don't like each other in the 1950s. There's the cool jazz fans and there's the trad jazz fans. But all that is mixed up. Skiffle, rock and roll, the cool jazz, the trad jazz all comes together. And I mean, it directly comes together here in the UK because we've got jazz musicians like Chris Barber bringing over Muddy Waters. And you got to remember, Hendrix is coming straight out of the tradition of the electric blues pioneered by Muddy Waters. So this new thing starts to emerge, and it all comes together in the 1960s with the addition of the Beatles, with Bob Dylan, with a whole bunch of people. And you feel that something's forming. But until 1967, there is no real rock music. There is no real funk. There is no real soul. There's no real psychedelia or prog. Until Hendrix comes along. And Hendrix is playing, phrasing, personality, songwriting, singing, defines the genre. That's why when you go through his albums, they seem to be genius continually. All Jimmy has to do is go in and plug in and start playing, and it's groundbreaking and genius, and people love it. I love it. I can listen to Jimmy just jamming on everything, and you can go back to these loose end records and find him jamming on all sorts of strange songs, which are obviously jokes at the time, not intended to be released. But such is his personality. It's more than his vision or his virtuosity. It's more than his ability to think into the future and to go back to the past. It's Jimmy's personality. Jimmy's personality is rock and roll. It is rock in every single way, right? We have this trio of musicians in the 20th century, don't we? Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, and Jimi Hendrix. Right, all American, all black. I'm saying this, to make the point of the input that black American musicians have had on 20th century music. Undeniable and incredible. Hendrix, like Charlie Parker, does not last that long. Right, he may be going to the studio. And if you think of Charlie Parker, I mean, I think this is where my video here is perhaps going to be unique in terms of all the stuff that's been added to the Jimi Hendrix story, is that I am really placing him in the history of jazz, right? When he does Machine Gun, when he does Voodoo Child, there is nothing that has, maybe say Cream's live recording, so that's true, yeah, we've got that, but Hendrix's influence on jazz and his lineage within jazz is profound. And the comparisons across are very interesting. So with Louis Armstrong, there's the apocryphal story that he invented scat singing when he went in to record Heebie Jeebies, and he was reading the lyrics off a music stand, and the bit of paper fell on the floor, and he had to make up the words. In other words, Louis was such a genius, that whatever he did, it just came out, because his very presence and personality just happened. It's like, and you feel that when you listen to Louis Armstrong. Charlie Parker, when he was in the haze of drug addiction and alcoholism, turned up to record Lover Man, in a state where he could hardly play. Um, and recorded this track, and then I think at the end of the session he was so frustrated that he got his saxophone and he threw it, at the window of the recording console. I think that's the story. These are apocryphal stories in the history of jazz. And yet, although he's not displaying the virtuosity, it, Lover Man by Charlie Parker is a work of absolute genius that really explores the ability of that guy to play genius material, but also to express that point that he was at. And Hendrix with this sort of repackaging of all this stuff that may not have been intended to be put out with his perfectionist view and vision over and over again. We can see that. This is a testament to these three musicians as being the embodiment of popular music at that time. Unlike Led Zeppelin, unlike the Beatles, unlike the Rolling Stones or James Brown, we do not have a discography to look at. We're talking about 3 years, basically. It's astonishing what he managed to do. It's very difficult to not think that throughout the 70s, through some sort of spiritualist way, Jimmy was releasing all this material. Because in 1970, he recorded enough stuff in around about 6 months to keep those releases going throughout the 70s. I can't think of another artist like this. When Kurt Cobain died at the same age as 27, what did the record company find to put out? What we saw throughout the 70s was 6 albums of material that came out, and those albums are good. Jimi Hendrix was a shooting star that burnt brightly. Whether he'd have gone into the 70s and been even more genius, could the world have taken it? What would have happened? Or would the times have moved on and what he was doing become less relevant? And by the time you get to the mid 70s with disco and punk, he would be relegated. And very much like what happened with Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton's guitar playing is incredible in Cream. It's incredible in the John Mayall Band, and it's incredible with Derek the Dominoes. And it occupies the same period. If Clapton had died after Derek of the Dominoes' album, right, and I'm sure there's a lot of live Cream stuff and all that stuff would have been put out, but we may see Eric in a completely different way to the way we see him now, because of the legacy of him carrying on and almost becoming sort of an 80s cheesy pop star with Phil Collins on drums, and doing all that stuff with a lot of sequencing and drum machines. How would have Hendrix even been able to operate in the 1980s? Standing there with a mullet in a Roland guitar synth. So it's impossible to imagine a world with Hendrix. And so we are left with these 3 years worth of material, which has completely enthralled so many people for all these years. Where for me personally, in terms of rock music or rock and roll or whatever you want to call it, Jimmy was the best. That should be his legacy. But I feel that legacy is waning. I feel that the reason why Jimmy was so important was because in the 1960s, culturally, the idea of free expression became so important. The idea that you should express your soul. And I think that's what you hear when you listen to Jimi Hendrix albums. And I think in today's climate, which is a lot more sort of pinned down and uptight and conservative and simplistic, the young audience would rather listen to Queen, which is a band that meticulously sat there in the studio building up track after track of absolute perfection. There's a perfectionism in Hendrix, but there's a wild abandon that he never forgot. That, for me, is the definition of the sublime. It is hedonism perfectly balanced with perfectionism. And I think Hendrix naturally had that. He just had an ability to understand where he came from, where he was going, and how to create a recording that was still alive, right? So you never feel that Hendrix is going to go redo anything because he hit a few bum notes. He'll go in and record it because he hasn't connected enough with the great spirit of creativity, which only true artists can access at the frequency that Jimmy could. So I think I've come to the end of this video now. I hope you've got an idea of the layout of Jimmy's albums. I'm going to go through my ranking again, so it might make a bit more sense now we've gone through it. So at number 9, I have 9 to the Universe, which is an Alan Douglas album that was released right at the end, the last of the sort of studio material, and contains a lot of dodgy jams, except for the jam he did with Larry Young and Dave Holland, which really does have the seeds of jazz rock fusion on it, right? So it's pretty important, and I would say what they're doing on there, if it had been released, it's a funny thing with jazz rock, you see. When Miles Davis made Jack Johnson, which is the album everyone points at, he did a track called Duran. Now Duran is out and out jazz rock, but you feel that was a rest. Why wasn't that put on the album? Why did it not come out until 1981? Was it on Directions? Is that when it first came out? Why wasn't it put out? It's a masterpiece. It's because they didn't understand what they were doing. It's the same thing with this. They've gone into the studio, they've jammed with Larry Young. Larry Young's an absolute genius. He's doing things on the keyboard no one else has done. Dave Holland's a highly exploratory bass. This is not rock music, and they do this jam. But it was probably just for them a jam, so they don't think, well, this really needs to come out because this is a statement. And so, but it shows what the musicians were doing. So that's what I got at number 9. At number 8, I have Midnight Lightning, the second of the Alan Douglas releases with the overdub musicians on. It's got some fantastic tracks on it, but not quite as good as Crash Landing, which came out the year before, or a couple of years before. I've got that at number 7. Number 6, Loose Ends, which is a collection of outtakes and stuff that didn't make. They were just basically weren't finished recordings that were made in that 1970s period. There's a few recordings of Hear My Train Coming. There's a version, an awful version of Machine Gun, a studio version of Machine Gun as well, on these albums. Can't remember which one that's on. Even with all the research I'm doing, I'm loath to actually name what track is on what album. You can tell the reason is because you ain't got a clue. It's like trying to sort all this out, and I didn't grow up with these albums. Then at number 5, I have First Rays of the New Rising Sun, which is the album that was put together by Eddie Kramer and Mitch Mitchell, and is a representation of what he did do in the 1970s, essential album. And there was a part of me wanted to put that at number 1, but I knew that would just be too iconoclastic. I knew I couldn't do it, but there's a good argument there for that. At number 4, I got Axis Bold Love, his second album. At number 3, I got the Band of Gypsies album. Number 2, Electric Ladyland. And then number 2, the debut Are You Experience. Now, as I said, feel that Jimi Hendrix is losing his foothold. Now, I can't do much about it, but I'm at least going to try. So I'm going to really, really pummeling Jimi Hendrix, I think. I'm going to do next... Get the old superiometer out, dust it down, and we'll stick the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix into the superiometer and see who wins. And also, I'm going to probably do a deep dive into the 3 studio albums, starting with Are You Experienced? I've got to be honest, I hadn't heard it for years. So when I did this, I put it on. And when I heard Third Stone from the Sun, that was recorded in 1966, 67. I think they started in 66 and it went round. It's about March 1967, before Sgt. Pepper's come out. Jimmy recorded Third Stone from the Sun. Go and listen to it. It's the first prog jazz rock track, first everything. It's all done it on that track, right? It's the totality of everything. Everything that rock and roll is on that track. And that melody. Last night I was watching something. Who was I watching? Oh, it was a documentary on Fishbone, and they're playing Fishbone. Incredible. One of the greatest bands of all time. Probably the most underrated band of all time. Angelo Moore, maybe the greatest frontman of any band ever. I was watching him going, this is just insane. That guy is a creative genius. But Fishbone, it's like the spirit of JIMI is working through them. That's why they're so amazing. That's probably why they weren't a hugely successful band. And in the midst of all this, suddenly I hear, that's a melody. How many rock musicians have created a melody like that? Have you ever listened to I'm Too Sexy for My Shirt? As you can see, I am not. Right? I'm too sexy for my shirt. Too sexy for my shirt. You know that track by Right Said Fred? It's a big trackie of the UK. I don't know what the Americans know about British culture, but you may not know that track, but you may do. But if you listen to the chorus of that track, that huge pop song, that silly novelty song, it's a great song, but a silly novelty song, what's the chorus of that? Number one, JIMI. JIMI, you were the man. JIMI, I hope you're watching this and I hope you're listening. You were the man. Right, I'm still not going to finish. I've got one more tale to tell. My mentor and best friend is a guy called Kevin Gammon. He was the guitarist in the Band of Joy with Robert Plant and John Bonham. In 1969-70, they went over to the Whiskey A Go-Go and they played with people like Dwayne Allman and all that sort of stuff. Kev's my best friend. He will not come on this channel and I will not be able to get him on this channel. But I talk to him all the time. We were chatting about Jimi Hendrix the other day and he was telling me about how he was playing guitar for Tim Rose in, I think, could have been 68, 69. John Bonham's on drums, and they did a tour with Jimi Hendrix. And Kev spent the week with Jimmy. And I said, what was he like? And he said he was a lovely guy, quite quiet, like everyone says. He was often cooked backstage. He would always have the guitar around his neck. And my friend Kevin used to sit down and jam. He used to jam with Jimi Hendrix. He said they'd sit down and sit and play the guitar opposite each other and just jam. He said when you sat down face to face, he was a very good guitar player, but there was nothing extraordinary about him as a guitar player, right? What made him extraordinary was not the guitar playing, it was his vision. Yeah. And I wonder whether today's sort of virtuoso guitar world that we live in, which totally comes from Jimmy, that a modern audience cannot tune in to the visionary aspects of his guitar playing. Just before I filmed this, I was listening to the Isle of Wight live album, and there's a version on Machine Gun. Not quite as good as the Band of Gypsies version, but Hendrix's guitar solo is sublime on it. And I was listening to it again, and he's just playing the blues. It's just pentatonic notes, but somehow this is stratospheric in the same way as John Coltrane is. And it's to do with Jimmy's intention. And when he's playing on this, I was watching it on video, he's looking up and something is working through him. He was a musician who could directly connect, and those are few and far between. I'm done now. If you like this video, please put a like on it. Please put a like on it. It's not going to hurt you, but I really started pushing my viewers to put likes on the channel, and it really did a lot of good. And I suddenly started to have some real good views on the video because the algorithm was going, oh, people like this video. So please put a like on the video. If you want to see some more, subscribe. Again, You know, the subscriber list is so important. It's not going to hurt you putting this subscribing tick on this. You know, it will make no difference. If you only subscribe to 10 channels, all you're going to get when you put YouTube on is those 10 channels. If the subscription thing actually works, if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, does it? You know, if the algorithm's taking something else in, because the algorithm's changing all the time, it's how YouTube works. But if you subscribe and you end up with 500 subscriptions, does it really matter? Because what you're going to see is what you like, I promise you. It'll be based on your searches and things you click on when you first go on. But by subscribing, this will be put in front of other people that are like you, and they may go, oh, I'll have a click on that bloke, and then my channel will go up. Now, why should you care about my channel going up? Because I'm trying to champion this music. I'm trying to keep it going. So, subscribe. If you want to support me, you can go to my Patreon. Now, on Patreon, I have a ton of video content. I play actual music, so you can actually hear the music, because you don't have the copyright YouTube robot, you know, taking your videos down every time you play some music. I know I'd love to play music on this channel, but I can't. And I've got like articles, my whole discography is there, there's recordings. Once a month, I try and do twice a month, but I always get really busy. But once a month, without fail, we have the patron meeting. Now, recently I've been using that in the main content, but that meeting, last one was 3 hours long, and I record it and then it goes in and we talk about a whole bunch of stuff, and there's some really interesting stuff on those videos. So you get access to all that, but you also get access to the patron WhatsApp group, which has got around about 60 or 70 people in there, hardcore music fans, and you go in there. My fans are so knowledgeable about music, and we have incredible discussions. I actually tend to keep out of it. These guys are sharing all sorts of music, and also there's creative music makers in there, and they are sharing their music. And because they become part of this community in my Patreon, and because my community is a proper music fans, that's what I'm trying to do here. You know, not Oasis fans, not people that only listen to Nirvana, proper music fans. So if you're a proper music fan, get in there and get in that WhatsApp. And if you're an artist that wants to get your weird, esoteric, weird music out there to a like-minded audience, by joining my Patreon, you'll be able to also put your music in there. There's no rules. Colin Baxter, who's one of my patrons, is watching over it. He's the moderator for that Patreon group. I have very little to do with it. Colin, it was his idea. It's worked really well. So thank you, Colin, very much for your stuff that you have done. There's certain patrons I've got that are incredible, and they've supported me so much recently. And Colin has said that he has run quite a few WhatsApp groups. Never has he run anything where he has to kick anyone out, because they're so lovely. So if you want to join a lovely gang of people, right now, if you join as a free member over at my Patreon, you will still get articles, because I still write articles for the free people, for the free members, you know, so they don't feel like they're sort of poor, you know, waifs outside the window looking in at the Patreon party. But it's £5 a month. If you want to join it, come over. If you get fed up, you just click it. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's it, you know. And if you want to come over, just do a month. But I promise you, once you're in there, you'll stay, because there's so much going on. But if you don't want to do that, but you want to support me in another way, please go down to my YouTube PayPal tip jar and stick a bit of cash in there. As I keep saying, I have made the leap to doing this. I wouldn't say full time, because I'm still gigging, I'm still teaching, and I'm still doing bits and bobs, but I'm trying to make this work, and it's an interesting world I'm in at the moment, because I know, for example, that these Jimi Hendrix videos are not going to do so well, right? And so there is an urge to want to just go, you know, the most overrated singles of all time. That at the moment, the word overrated just brings them in, right? 1 week I did one of my favorite albums of all time, Amigos by Santana. I did a whole video on it, talked about it. It was brilliant. I love it so much. It's great. One of my favorite albums, blah, blah, blah. And then a day later, I did an album I absolutely hate, Astral Weeks. Now, that I cannot believe it because it's such a nothing video. It's just me moaning how much I hate an album. It's not like this one that's taken like me listening and thinking and researching and trying to come up with something I can say which is has got says something more about JIMI that's all the other stuff, you know, so it's not a waste of time me just coming on and going through the albums like everybody else. It just has been moaning about how much I hate Astral Weeks, which I do hate it, right? That got the views because it's negative. You got to understand this. And I have to do it to keep the channel going. And if you're watching it and you're a new viewer, the reason why this has been poked under your nose is because of these negative videos. This is how YouTube works. It's on negativity and controversy. All right. And I quite enjoy it. I think this is why it's a good thing for me to do YouTube, because I have a sense of humour in criticising stuff. I mean, there's been no joking on this because this is Jimi Hendrix. There's been no joking. A few silly comments, I mean, but on the whole, I have just been serious. But I enjoy a good joke. I enjoy some silliness, and I love having a moan. I love being a curmudgeon. I love being seen as the grumpy bloke that doesn't like Astral Weeks. You know, it's upset some people. People are there saying, I'm never going to watch this again. This is too low, blah, blah, blah. Look, it's music. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. That's why I love music so much. It does not matter. Music to me matters a lot in terms of I love it, and it's been the thing that's brought my life together and all that type of stuff. But if some bloke comes out and says he doesn't like certain, I mean, and I've got to be honest, it's like what I find is if I listen to an album like Astral Weeks, and I told the story about how I put that on because I thought I was older and I was going to suddenly appreciate it because I was too young when I first heard it, and I still absolutely hate it. But in defending myself and listening to all the comments, and seeing how many people love that album, it's a great album. I can objectively say it's a great album. I can't hear it. But what's interesting is I was arguing with someone, and I said, look, it's not that I'm against this type of music because people say you just don't like it, blah, blah, blah. And I go, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall by Dylan does what Van Morrison's trying to do on this album, but he does it so much better, and he does it before. Now, I know deep down that's no real argument, because he's basically saying, like, if there's something better, then you can't listen to it. It's a stupid argument. But anyway, that's what I said. And so I went and put on Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Now, I've got to be honest, I'm not a massive Bob Dylan fan, but I know the guy's a genius. But in trying to get my head around Astral Weeks and making sure that the things I'm criticising isn't me just being a curmudgeon and not liking it, that I've actually got something that's to stand on that's solid. With that in mind, I had an idea what I thought Astral Week should have been and how it had failed, right? Because I think that's the only way you can really criticise something. So I go and put Hard Rain's Gonna Fall on by Bob Dylan, and my hair stood on end. I loved it. So Astral Weeks might not have persuaded me that I love Astral Weeks, but it has helped me to understand the musical aspect of Dylan, his phrasing, his ability to sit within a very simple structure and just weave. And on Hard Rain's Going to Fall, to make a statement, an esoteric, spiritual statement about the world within a framework that relates to sort of free modal jazz, but isn't free modal jazz. And it's an absolute work of genius. Absolute work of genius. And in a way, I can see how, if you think of the way that Dylan is singing on that and phrasing, and then you could listen to Hendrix play Machine Gun and think of what Machine Gun is about and the poetry in that, I start to have a much deeper understanding. And this is the serious bit. We have to with the arts. It's like, doesn't matter if somebody says they don't like something you like. This doesn't mean it's bad. There's no such thing as good or bad. But the conversation is important, because in having these conversations, it pinpoints us. So we're all sort of on the same page of what art is. And art is being maligned at the moment. I was listening to the radio. Somebody was trying to explain. They were trying to explain how important art was. And they were trying their best, and I commend them for doing it. But it was a terrible explanation. You know, it's like art's really good because it gives people a chance to express themselves, and they could hear. And you could sometimes you could change society by art and all this sort of stuff. And I thought this person really doesn't understand the true mind blowing impact that art has, and it's so huge it's almost like invisible. And if we took it away from society, it's a little, but it's a little bit like the senses. It's the cultural senses. Now, there's a theory that if you could take a person and take away all their senses, smell, touch, hearing, seeing, the whole lot, so there's no sensory information coming, none whatsoever. If you do that, that person's dead. And so culturally, I believe we're dead. You cannot think and look round you and not pick up something. Right. That's an aesthetic thing. That is what you're seeing. It looks like a book of Jaco Pastorius baselines. But, you know, in the way that's been presented, the white and the red, Jaco's face, the lighting, the angle, you know, the way the bass looks, that's an aesthetic thing. If you take that away and how that's been negotiated, the culture dies. That needs to be argued. And I think for some reason my life has panned out that because I've struggled with this and thought about it, I think I got something to say on that. So for those of you who get upset when I'm doing what I'm doing, it is silly. Don't get upset. But please, if you step back, I might be making a point that is way beyond just the fact that I think Astro Weeks is a pile of crap. But before I go, I've got to say, it is a pile of crap. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you on the next one. I've got a new way of recording this, and I don't know how to switch it off now. Stop recording. Bye bye.